There are battles that don't just decide the fate of a single city, but change the course of an entire war. Stalingrad was one of them, a place where hundreds of thousands of people were swept into a storm of gunfire, freezing cold, and starvation. A place where an army once considered unstoppable was swallowed by the ruins along the banks of the Volga River. And the most terrifying part is that the deeper one looks into this battle, the clearer it becomes that Stalingrad was not just a military defeat, but a tragedy born from ambition, from orders, and from stubbornness pushed to its absolute limit. If you enjoy war history stories told with depth, intensity, and emotion, make sure to subscribe to the History War channel so you don't miss the upcoming videos. And now, let us step into one of the most brutal battles in human history. Before it became a symbol of destruction, Stalingrad was simply a major industrial city on the banks of the Volga River. It was not the capital. It was not the supreme center of power in the Soviet Union, but it was an extremely important link in the vast nation's system of transportation, production, and logistics. From its river ports, railway stations, factories, steel plants, machine workshops, and the transport routes that ran through the city, goods, raw materials, fuel, food supplies, and reinforcements could flow outward to every direction of the war. In that sense, Stalingrad was not just a city, it was an artery. But history can be cruel in a very particular way. Sometimes a place that is important only in material terms is suddenly elevated into a powerful symbol simply because of the name it carries. Stalingrad was the city that bore Stalin's name, and in a war between two regimes that both believed absolutely in the power of will, a symbol is never just a symbol. It can become an order, it can become an obsession, it can become the reason tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people could continue to be thrown into the fire simply to prove that retreat is impossible. To understand why Stalingrad became such a terrifying turning point of World War II on the Eastern Front, we have to step back for a moment and return to the summer of 1942. At that time, Nazi Germany was still a war machine that terrified all of Europe. Even though the previous winter had halted them at the gates of Moscow, even though the first limits of blitzkrieg had begun to appear, Hitler had not accepted that the war might turn into a long war of attrition. He still believed that if he could find the right weakness and strike hard enough, the Soviet Union would break. That was the most frightening part of Hitler's thinking. Failure did not make him more cautious. It only made him more determined to search for a new gamble. After the winter of 1941 to 1942, instead of admitting that Germany was being dragged into a war far too large, too long, and too costly for its real capacity to sustain, Hitler continued to believe that victory was still within reach as long as he attacked in the right direction. And in his mind, that direction was no longer Moscow. The Southern Soviet Union, in his view, held the answer. There were vast wheat fields, great river networks, strategic transport routes, and farther south lay the Caucasus, home to the oil fields that Hitler was almost obsessed with. Maikop, Grozny, Baku, these names were not just points on a map, they were the blood of modern warfare. Without oil, tanks are nothing but scrap metal. Without fuel, aircraft are simply lifeless shells sitting on the runway. Without a steady supply, even the most battle-hardened army will eventually collapse from exhaustion. But on the road toward the south, along the banks of the Volga, there stood a name that cut directly across both strategic calculation and symbolic obsession: Stalingrad. At first, it could be seen as an important military objective. Cutting off Stalingrad meant severing a vital transport artery. It meant disrupting the flow of oil, food, raw materials, and reinforcements moving from the south toward the Soviet center. But very quickly, the meaning of the city expanded beyond any dry calculation of logistics. It became a personal challenge between two dictators. For Hitler, capturing Stalingrad would be a propaganda victory of enormous value, a direct humiliation aimed at Stalin himself. For Stalin, losing the city that bore his name would not just mean losing a strategic position, but losing face, losing morale, losing a symbol he could not easily surrender. And when a city stops being merely a city, and instead becomes the place where the honor, power, and will of both sides are bound together, retreat almost ceases to exist. The calculations on paper begin to lead to increasingly rigid decisions, increasingly cold orders, and the price paid on the battlefield starts to rise exponentially. The irony is that many disasters in history begin with arrows on a map that look perfectly reasonable. In headquarters, everything can appear neat and tidy. German forces will push south, seize essential regions, cut the enemy off from its lifelines, and force the Soviet Union to collapse. But war does not unfold on paper. It unfolds on dusty roads that turn into mud, on railway lines that must be rebuilt, on bridges that can be blown apart, on supply convoys that run out of fuel in the middle of the steppe, and on soldiers and horses pulling artillery who collapse from exhaustion. Behind the impressive image of an army that had once made all of Europe tremble, the German war machine had already begun to breathe heavily, and the deeper it advanced, the more labored that breathing became. Even as they believed they were moving closer to victory, the first signs of catastrophe were quietly taking shape. Everything began with a decision, a gamble. Once again, Hitler chose to believe in the power of a decisive blow rather than the limits of reality. And in the summer of 1942, Nazi Germany turned decisively toward the south, toward a region they believed could strangle the Soviet Union, but which was also where fate was quietly preparing the greatest trap of the entire war. In the summer of 1942, Hitler once again decided to gamble. But this was not the kind of gamble made by a desperate man forced to rely on chance. On the contrary, it was the gamble of a man who still believed too strongly in his own instincts, who still believed that by changing the direction of the punch, by shifting the strategic point of impact, the entire course of the war could be bent. After the failure before Moscow in the winter of 1941 to 1942, Berlin should have understood that the war with the Soviet Union would no longer end with lightning strikes. The Red Army had not collapsed. The Soviet state had not disintegrated. Their industries were still running. New armies kept appearing. But Hitler refused to see that failure as evidence that the overall strategy had been wrong. He saw it as a delay, a temporary misstep, a stumble that could be corrected with an even more violent blow. And right there, a dangerous illusion began to grow. Hitler believed the Soviet Union could still be knocked out if struck in the right vital spot. Not Moscow, not the symbolic center of power, but the south, where the resources that fed a modern war were concentrated: oil, grain, river transport, rail networks, heavy industry, and logistical depth. In Hitler's mind, war was not just about occupying territory. War was about suffocating the enemy. And to suffocate the Soviet Union, he wanted to squeeze what he believed was its material heart. Southern Soviet territory therefore appeared like a land of destiny. There lay the basins of the Don and the Volga rivers. There were vast wheat fields. Transport routes ran along the lifelines of the country. And farther still lay the Caucasus, home to the oil fields Hitler was almost obsessed with, so much so that he saw them as the key to the entire war. Maikop, Grozny, Baku. To Hitler, these names were not merely economic objectives. They were promises of fuel for tanks, for aircraft, for supply convoys, for an entire war machine that was consuming more and more than Germany itself could sustain. This was the great paradox of the Third Reich at that moment. On the surface, the German army still appeared extremely powerful. It controlled a vast stretch of Europe. It possessed some of the most battle-hardened armies in the world. But deep underneath, that machine was under mounting pressure. The longer the war lasted, the more fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, and transportation capacity became crushing burdens. Germany did not merely want to defeat the Soviet Union. Germany needed to win quickly, or at least seize resources large enough to sustain a longer war. And Hitler believed the South would provide exactly that. From this logic, the plan for the summer campaign of 1942 was born. Moscow was no longer the priority. The main thrust now had to drive south. Army Group South, one of the largest Wehrmacht formations on the Eastern Front, was tasked with carrying out this strategic breakthrough. The objective sounded both clear and ambitious: seize the lower Volga region, cut the Soviet Union's crucial transport artery, then push deep into the Caucasus to capture the oil fields. If successful, Hitler believed the Soviet Union would be stripped of the material lifelines necessary to continue the war, while Germany would gain precisely what it lacked most. But at the very moment that ambition was drawn up, The seeds of disaster were already embedded within the plan. The problem was not that striking the south was entirely unreasonable. The problem was that the ambition was far greater than Germany's real capacity to sustain it. Hitler did not want to capture just one objective. He wanted several at once. He wanted to cut the Volga, hold multiple advancing fronts, plunge deep into the Caucasus, and maintain enough pressure to prevent the Soviet Union from recovering. And to achieve this, he split Army Group South into two massive wings. Army Group A would advance into the Caucasus. Army Group B would head toward the Volga and Stalingrad. On the map, the divisions seemed logical. One wing would seize the oil, the other would sever transportation. Two thrusts supporting each other, creating the impression of a hand slowly tightening around southern Soviet territory. But maps have their own dangerous coldness. They do not clearly show the real distances between attacking columns. They do not reveal the exhaustion of railways that must be converted, the bridges that must be protected, the dusty summer roads that turn to mud when the seasons change, the trucks worn down day after day, the engines overheating, the tank tracks cracking, the horses pulling artillery collapsing in open fields. The deeper an offensive pushes forward, the longer the logistical shadow stretching behind it becomes. And when Hitler split his forces into two large wings, he did not merely divide the direction of attack. He divided the fuel, the reserves, the armored strength, the air support, and even the ability to rescue one another if one wing ran into disaster. It was in this context that Germany's Sixth Army was pushed into the central role. This was one of the strongest and most experienced armies Germany possessed on the Eastern Front. Its commander was Friedrich Paulus, a typical German staff officer. Calm, precise, disciplined, highly organized, and largely devoid of theatrical flair. Paulus was not like the generals famous for bold gambles or personal glory. He was a man of plans, of orders, of obedience. In a massive campaign requiring layers of coordination, he seemed like a sensible choice. But war does not only test command ability. It tests the ability to break out of habitual thinking when circumstances change, and that would later become the psychological trap from which Paulus could not escape. During the first weeks of the summer campaign, German forces advanced quite rapidly. The vast steppe of southern Soviet territory seemed to open before them. Armored units were still capable of deep breakthroughs. Many German soldiers believed that this time they were truly moving in the right direction. After the frustration before Moscow, they once again felt the speed of a rapid advance. The clouds of dust behind tank tracks, the reports showing the enemy continuing to retreat. That feeling was dangerous because it created the illusion that the German war machine still possessed the same strength it had shown in the early days of Operation Barbarossa. But the reality behind that momentum was far more complicated. Every kilometer conquered added a new burden to the supply system. Soviet railways had a different gauge, forcing the Germans to advance while simultaneously converting the tracks. Many railway hubs had not yet stabilized when the front had already surged far beyond them. Trucks had to drive increasingly long distances under brutal conditions, grinding down machinery at an alarming rate. Fuel consumed simply to transport fuel to the front sometimes became a cruel paradox. The Luftwaffe, though still powerful, could not be everywhere across a front that kept stretching farther and farther. And perhaps most importantly, the flanks of the advancing spearheads began to be entrusted to weaker forces. To allow the main German formations to keep driving forward, Berlin assigned large sections of the front line to Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian troops. On paper, this conserved German strength for the main thrust. In reality, it was an extremely dangerous gamble. These Allied armies were not necessarily lacking in courage, but they lacked many of the tools needed to face a large-scale mechanized counteroffensive. They lacked modern anti-tank guns. They lacked mobile reserves. They lacked defensive depth. They lacked the ability to withstand a major operational strike from the Red Army. In other words, while the German blade was thrusting deeper and deeper into the Soviet body, the handle of that blade was becoming thinner and more fragile than ever. This was the point that Stavka, the Soviet high command, watched very closely. In Moscow, Stalin and his generals understood that 1942 was still an extremely dangerous year. The Red Army was not yet strong enough to immediately halt and reverse every German advance. But they had learned something critically important from the bloody months before. If you cannot stop your enemy everywhere, let him advance deep enough that the very length of his victory becomes his weakness. They could retreat, they could trade land for time, but they had to preserve the structure of their war effort, preserve their industry, preserve their mobilization capacity, preserve the will to counterattack in the future. And then, amid all these movements, one name slowly began to rise. First as a logistical objective, then as a symbol, and finally as an obsession: Stalingrad. At first glance, it was simply a city on the Volga lying along the path of Army Group B's advance. Capturing it would allow the Germans to cut an extremely important transport route, severely threatening the flow of raw materials, oil, and reinforcements within the Soviet Union. But war has never functioned purely through military value alone. Stalingrad carried something far more dangerous within it: the name Stalin. And once a city bearing the name of the Soviet Union's supreme leader began appearing more and more clearly on German operational maps, it was no longer just another objective. It was becoming the place where strategy, symbolism, and the personal ambitions of two dictators were about to collide, with an explosion that would shake the course of history. If you looked at Stalingrad only through the eyes of a staff officer standing over a giant map spread across a table, the city could be described in fairly dry numbers. It stood on the banks of the Volga, the largest river in Europe, a transport route stretching thousands of kilometers and linking southern Soviet territory to the industrial centers in the north. It had major factories, railway systems, river ports, and an important logistical network. From Stalingrad, oil from the Caucasus, grain from the south, and raw materials from many other regions could move along the Volga to sustain the entire Soviet war economy. If that flow could be cut, Germany could significantly weaken its enemy's ability to keep fighting. But war rarely revolves around such simple material values alone. There are places where geography and symbolism overlap so completely that they cannot be separated. Stalingrad was exactly such a place. That city did not just sit on the Volga, it bore Stalin's name, and that fact alone pushed it beyond every purely military logic of strategy. In a war between two regimes that both believed absolutely in the power of political will, symbols could be more dangerous than any railway or factory. For Hitler, capturing Stalingrad would be a massive propaganda blow. The image of German troops planting their flag over a city bearing Stalin's name could echo across Europe and the world. It would be like a message declaring that even the symbol of the Soviet regime could not stand against the power of the Wehrmacht. In Hitler's mind, this was not just a military victory, it was a psychological one. On the other side, Stalin understood that very clearly. To him, Stalingrad was no longer just a point on the map. It was honor. It was the prestige of the regime. It was the spirit of an entire nation being pushed to the very limits of endurance. If the city that bore his name fell into the hands of the invader without fighting to the very end, the psychological cost would be beyond measure. And so, even though Stalingrad was not the capital and not the supreme center of Soviet power, it quickly became a place from which there could be no retreat. It was here that war began to step out of the cold calculations of logistics and into the dark territory of honor and obsession. Moscow understood that the German army was driving south with enormous ambition. They also understood that it was impossible to stop every thrust at once. But they decided that Stalingrad had to be held at any cost. In July 1942, Stalin issued Order Number 227, one of the most famous and also most ruthless directives of the war: not one step back. That phrase was not merely propaganda. It came with very specific coercive measures. Blocking detachments were deployed behind the front to prevent unauthorized retreat. Penal battalions were created where those who had been disciplined or were under suspicion could be thrown into the most dangerous sectors to redeem themselves with blood. That was how the Soviet war machine functioned at its most dangerous moment: patriotism, fear, and the terrible endurance of human beings. Those three elements fused together into a resistance that many German officers at the time did not yet fully understand. As the German armies moved closer to the Volga, Stalingrad began to change day by day. The bustling industrial city of factories, rail stations, residential districts, river ports, and construction sites was gradually turning into a chaotic fortress. During the day, workers still stood at lathes and assembly lines, still producing tanks, artillery, and ammunition for the war. But when night fell, they picked up shovels, picks, and crowbars, digging trenches, erecting obstacles, stacking sandbags, and turning every street corner into a defensive position. Wide squares became artillery emplacements. Large buildings were prepared as strong points. Basements were reinforced into shelters and aid stations. Windows were turned into firing ports. Streets were mined. Concrete blocks and broken-down trucks were dragged into the roads to form obstacles against tanks. In many neighborhoods, walls between houses were even broken through, so soldiers could move from one building to another without exposing themselves outside. The line between rear area and front line slowly disappeared. Inside the city, people could still hear the machinery from the big factories, but mixed into it were the sounds of shovels, military trucks, distant artillery, and air raid sirens growing more frequent by the day. Columns of evacuees hurried away carrying whatever they could hold. Women, children, and the elderly crowded onto trains or barges on the Volga, but many could not leave, partly because there was not enough transport, partly because the fighting was advancing too quickly, and partly because the authorities wanted to keep the workforce needed for industry and defense. During those weeks, Stalingrad existed in a strange state. The city was still functioning, the factories were still running, but everything carried the feeling of waiting for a storm. On the outskirts, Red Army units began building temporary defensive lines. Fresh troops were brought in by train or truck, many of them men who had never seen real war before. They were sent straight to the forming defense zones, digging trenches, setting up machine guns, and waiting. On the other side, as German forces advanced across the wide fields and open steppe, their command viewed Stalingrad as a target that could be broken by firepower. From their perspective, the city lay almost at the end of the attack corridor. It had been cut off from many of its supply sources to the west. The German Air Force still held a significant advantage in the sky. Experienced armored and infantry units were closing in. If they unleashed a powerful bombing strike, shattered the defenses, and then sent infantry in from multiple directions, Stalingrad could collapse just like many other cities before it. But there was one thing the map did not show. A city is not like the steppe. It has walls, basements, factories, corridors, staircases, and mazes through which tanks cannot move easily. And a city that has been heavily destroyed can sometimes become the ideal defensive terrain for men prepared to die where they stand. By August 1942, as Germany's Sixth Army approached the Volga, Stalingrad was ready to enter the storm. The civilians who remained in the city began living in basements. Anti-aircraft units prepared their ammunition. Ships on the Volga kept moving, bringing in reinforcements and carrying out the wounded, despite the constant danger of air attack. Soviet soldiers were ferried to the eastern bank of the river, then crossed through artillery fire and bombs into a city that everyone understood was about to become a nightmare battlefield. And then the Germans decided to throw the first punch. Not a probing blow, not a few scattered air raids, but a bombardment on a scale large enough to erase a city from the map. On August 23, 1942, the sky over Stalingrad began to tremble with the sound of hundreds of bombers diving in. And within just a few hours, the city on the Volga was about to become a sea of fire the world would never forget. August 23, 1942 began like many other wartime days in Stalingrad, with a pale gray sky above the Volga and the familiar sounds of a city living in the shadow of approaching disaster. But by mid-morning, people standing on the docks, on rooftops, or at observation points along the river began to hear a different sound. A dense, low, rolling noise like thunder that never stopped. It wasn't artillery. It was the engines of hundreds of aircraft approaching from the west. Soon after, black dots began to appear in the sky. The Luftwaffe had concentrated a significant portion of its air power for this strike. To the German High Command, this was not merely a routine air raid. It was meant to paralyze Stalingrad before the infantry moved in. High-explosive bombs would destroy factories, ports, and defensive positions. Incendiary bombs would burn through residential districts and warehouses. When the smoke cleared, they believed the city would be reduced to ruins incapable of organized resistance. The bombers began dropping their loads. Air raid sirens screamed across the city, but many people did not even have time to reach shelter. The first bombs fell on the outskirts, then quickly spread toward the center. Explosions shook the ground, windows shattered, walls trembled and collapsed, roofs were torn apart like paper. Streets that had once been crowded turned into corridors of smoke, dust, and screams. Unlike selective bombings aimed at specific military targets, the raid that day was one of total destruction. Bombs fell on railway stations, warehouses, residential blocks, hospitals, schools, markets, and rows of houses where thousands of civilians had still not managed to evacuate. Wooden buildings caught fire almost instantly. Fuel depots erupted in towering flames. Small fires quickly merged into enormous seas of fire. The wind blowing in from the steppe drove the flames through the city with terrifying speed. Within hours, entire districts of Stalingrad had turned into hell. People trapped in basements felt thick smoke pouring through cracks in doors and walls. Many suffocated before the flames ever reached them. Streets were blocked by rubble and burning vehicles. The wounded crawled through debris searching for shelter. Children were separated from their families. Columns of people fled toward the Volga while the sky above remained filled with aircraft. Then the incendiary bombs began their cruelest work. Bombs filled with burning compounds crashed onto rooftops and erupted into violent flames. Fire spread from house to house. Lumber yards, workshops, food depots, and homes became enormous furnaces. Thick black smoke climbed thousands of meters into the air, visible from far across the steppe. The heat distorted the air itself, making the landscape shimmer in a strange and terrifying way. In some places, the heat from the fires was so intense that it created small firestorms, swirling with ash, bricks, and glowing fragments of metal. Survivors later said there were streets where everything seemed to burn at once. Houses, vehicles, trees, warehouses, and people. Thousands of civilians died that day. Some were buried beneath collapsing buildings. Some burned in blazing neighborhoods. Some died trying to reach the riverbank when bombs struck the crowds. Entire families were erased within minutes. For them, Stalingrad ended on August 23rd. But war sometimes carries a bitter paradox. What the German command expected from this bombing did not happen exactly as planned. From the air, the city wrapped in smoke and flames looked completely destroyed. But on the ground, what the bombs left behind was not only devastation, they created a new terrain. Wide boulevards turned into fields of broken bricks and bomb craters. Residential districts became piles of collapsed walls, exposed basements, and shattered concrete. Factories were partially destroyed, leaving twisted steel frames, giant machines, and dark spaces full of obstacles. For mobile warfare, it was terrible terrain. But for defensive fighting, it was a perfect maze. A machine gun could hide behind a fallen wall. A sniper could lie in the second floor of a half-burned house. A squad could shelter in a basement and suddenly appear behind the enemy through a hole smashed in the wall. In other words, the bombs of the Luftwaffe had destroyed Stalingrad. But at the same time, they had turned it into the perfect battlefield for defenders determined to die where they stood. While the fires still burned across the city, the Volga became Stalingrad's final lifeline. Barges and tugboats continued crossing the river through smoke and bombs, bringing reinforcements, ammunition, and food to the western bank. On the return trips, they carried wounded soldiers and civilians out of the burning hell. Many vessels were sunk on the river. Many people died while crossing the water. But the flow did not stop. As long as the Volga remained open, Stalingrad was still alive. To the west of the city, as German advance units approached the outskirts, they saw a sight that was both impressive and terrifying. In front of them stood a city burning like a giant torch. Columns of black smoke twisted into the sky. Red flames glowed through the smoke. Many German officers believed that after such a bombardment, the Soviet defenses must have been crushed. But when the first units entered the shattered districts, they quickly realized that Stalingrad was not dead. It had only changed shape. In dark basements, in walls that had not fully collapsed, in factories filled with twisted steel, gunfire could still be heard. Red Army units that had survived began clinging to every corner, every pile of bricks, every corridor. They were no longer fighting to defend an intact city. They were fighting among the bones of the city itself. And that moment marked the terrible transformation of the Battle of Stalingrad. It was no longer a campaign to capture an urban center with artillery and tanks. It became a war in which the distance between the two sides could shrink to only a few dozen meters, sometimes just a few steps. A war in which every building, every staircase, every basement could change hands several times in a single day. The firestorm of August 23rd did not end Stalingrad. It merely opened the most brutal chapter of the battle. And from those ruins, a new kind of warfare began to emerge. A war no longer measured in kilometers on a map, but in meters of shattered brick, in individual rooms, and in human lives. While the great fires ignited on August 23rd were still smoldering above Stalingrad, German infantry began pushing into the city. But within only a few days, they realized that the battle before them was unlike anything they had experienced on the Eastern Front. Previous Wehrmacht campaigns had usually unfolded across the vast open spaces of the steppe or among small towns, where tanks, artillery, and aircraft could coordinate to break enemy lines. Stalingrad was different. Here, the space itself had been choked by rubble, collapsed walls, twisted steel, and dark corridors. Mobile warfare almost disappeared. In its place emerged a new kind of fighting, slow, intimate, and brutal beyond imagination. There were no longer clear front lines. There were no longer distances wide enough for artillery to clear the way before infantry advanced. In Stalingrad, the two sides were sometimes only a few dozen meters apart. There were buildings where the ground floor was held by German troops, while the upper floors remained in Red Army hands. There were houses that flew one flag during the day, only to change hands at night after a brief assault with grenades and submachine guns. Streets turned into labyrinths. Every corner could hide an ambush. From the first weeks of the street fighting, German soldiers began to feel that Stalingrad was a machine that crushed men. Not because the Red Army was always more numerous at every point, but because the city itself had become a trap. Piles of rubble blocked the view of tanks. Collapsed walls created hundreds of hiding places. Dark basements became places where Soviet soldiers could wait for hours before suddenly appearing behind their enemy. A German company might fight for hours to clear a city block, but the moment they settled into position, Soviet soldiers could emerge from basements behind them and launch a counterattack at a distance of just a few meters. Under such conditions, heavy firepower was far less effective than it had been in open battlefields. Artillery and bombers could destroy buildings, but every time they did so, they created new piles of rubble, and each pile of rubble became a new defensive position for the enemy. One place where the ferocity of the battle became especially clear was Mamayev Kurgan, a high hill overlooking much of the city and the banks of the Volga. Before the war, it had simply been a large mound rising gently from the landscape of Stalingrad. But once the fighting began, its position instantly became vital. Whoever held the top of the hill could observe the surrounding area, direct artillery fire, and control the main approaches into the city. For that reason, Mamayev Kurgan became the focus of furious struggle. The hill changed hands several times during the early weeks of the battle. Each attack began with intense artillery bombardment. Then infantry charged forward through smoke and craters. But almost as soon as one side captured the summit, the other would counterattack. The soil of Mamayev Kurgan was churned so violently that later people would say every square meter of ground contained hundreds of fragments of metal and shrapnel. The trees were completely destroyed. Grass could no longer grow. Only earth mixed with steel and blood remained. Another hotspot was the central railway station of Stalingrad. In a single day, the station could change hands multiple times. German troops stormed in, seized the main hall, and raised their flag. A few hours later, a Soviet unit counterattacked, throwing grenades past burning train cars and retaking the building. Then German artillery pounded the area again, infantry surged forward, and the cycle repeated. Derailed train cars became cover. Corridors filled with bodies. No one was fighting for the railway station's transportation value anymore. They fought for it because it was a controlling point in the city's maze. In this kind of warfare, the smallest details could decide life or death. A hole smashed through a wall could become an assault route. A staircase could become a front line. A dark room could conceal an entire squad. By day, units struggled to hold their positions. By night, small patrols crept through the rubble, launching sudden attacks with knives, grenades, and submachine guns. The war in Stalingrad no longer resembled large-scale battles. It became an endless chain of close-range clashes. Soldiers did not see the enemy from a distance. They heard breathing, footsteps, the scrape of metal against walls before the shooting began. Another factor that made the battle even more terrifying was the growing presence of snipers. In a ruined city, perfect firing positions appeared everywhere. Shattered windows, broken chimneys, the second floor of half-burned houses, or tall piles of brick. A patient sniper could pin down an entire platoon for hours. Bullets seemed to come from impossible directions, slowly grinding away at the nerves of the soldiers. But perhaps the most important element in this brutal struggle was the way the Red Army adapted. When General Vasily Chuikov was given command of the 62nd Army inside Stalingrad, he quickly understood that if Soviet forces kept too much distance from the Germans, German artillery and aircraft would simply annihilate them. So he introduced a simple but effective tactic: stay so close to the enemy that their artillery could not fire without hitting their own troops. Chuikov called it the tactic of hugging the enemy. Soviet units were ordered to keep extremely close to German positions. Sometimes they occupied houses directly next to German-held buildings. Sometimes they fought in the same building but on different floors. This made it extremely dangerous for the Germans to use artillery or bombers freely because the risk of striking their own soldiers became too great. That tactic turned Stalingrad into a primitive and savage battlefield. Grenades thrown through windows, submachine guns firing in dark corridors, bayonets and entrenching shovels used in hand-to-hand combat inside basements. There was no distance. There was no safe place. As the days passed, casualties mounted on both sides. German battalions were gradually worn down. Units that once numbered hundreds of men were reduced to only a few dozen. Officers were killed or wounded, forcing young soldiers to step into command. Yet they still had to keep pushing forward, because orders from above were clear. Stalingrad had to be captured at any cost. Meanwhile, the Red Army continued ferrying troops across the Volga at night. Fresh soldiers crossing the river often had only a few hours to rest before being thrown directly into battle. Many survived no more than a few days, but they kept coming, and that constant stream of reinforcements meant that the Germans could never truly clear any part of the city. Stalingrad gradually became something German soldiers began to call by a cold, grim name: Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. Not because they despised their enemy, but because both sides were forced to crawl through basements, sewers, and rubble like creatures living underground. The city was no longer a city. It had become a gigantic meat grinder. And within that grinding chaos, in the northern part of Stalingrad, 3 industrial complexes began to emerge as the final fortresses of resistance: the tractor factory, the Barricade factory, and the Red October steel plant. There, among steel frames and furnaces, among production lines and artillery shells, a new chapter of the Battle of Stalingrad was about to begin, where factories that once produced machines for peace would become the most brutal battlefield of the entire war. In the northern part of Stalingrad, where the Volga River curves tightly along the city, there was a stretch of land that before the war had been considered the industrial heart of the entire region. Enormous factories stood side by side, with tall smokestacks, heavy steel frames, glowing furnaces, and production lines that never stopped. There stood the Stalingrad tractor factory, the Barricade artillery plant, and the Red October steel works. In peacetime, these places produced agricultural machinery, steel artillery, and industrial components. But when the war arrived, the entire industrial district became something completely different: fortresses of steel, brick, and smoke. For the German command, capturing the factory district was critically important. If these 3 industrial complexes fell, the final defensive line of the Red Army on the western bank of the Volga would almost certainly collapse. The river would be cut off entirely, and once that happened, Stalingrad could be finished. So the Germans concentrated their efforts in the north, where they believed a powerful breakthrough could crush the last resistance. But what awaited them there were not ordinary factories. The Stalingrad tractor factory was the most famous. Before the war, it produced tractors for agriculture. When the war began, its assembly lines were converted to produce T-34 tanks, one of the most effective armored vehicles of the Red Army. This created one of the strangest images of the entire Battle of Stalingrad. Some tanks were assembled almost directly at the front line. The moment they rolled out of the factory floor, they drove straight into combat. The paint had not yet dried, some equipment had not even been fully completed. But there was no time to wait. The war had reached the factory gates. Barricade, the city's massive artillery factory, also became a deadly maze. The huge production halls, enormous lathes, steel frameworks, and cranes weighing dozens of tons created countless blind corners. In those corridors, Soviet machine guns were hidden behind blocks of metal. Snipers lay on high steel beams. Infantry hid in basements and machinery recesses. The Red October steel plant was no different. Its giant furnaces and networks of steel pipes formed a labyrinth that even maps could barely capture. When artillery shells struck the metal structures, the sound echoed violently, crashing against steel and concrete like thunder. Smoke, dust, sparks of metal, and the heat from the furnaces made the air suffocating and difficult to breathe. By the time the Germans began attacking the factory district, they were already exhausted after weeks of fighting in the city. Many units were far below strength. A company that officially should have had over 100 men might now have only a few dozen. Many officers had been killed or wounded. But the orders from higher command did not change. The factories had to be captured. The Red Army had to be pushed into the Volga. Stalingrad had to be finished. To adapt to the complex terrain, the Germans organized small assault groups. These teams included infantry, machine gunners, engineers carrying explosives, and sometimes flamethrower units. They advanced step by step through the maze of factory halls. Walls were blown open with charges. Steel doors were cut through. Holes were blasted between rooms to avoid crossing open courtyards. But inside the factories, everything was dangerous. A hallway might be covered by a machine gun at its far end. A staircase might be rigged with grenades. A dark window might hide a sniper. When a German assault group blew open a wall and rushed into the next room, they could immediately face a Soviet squad waiting behind massive steel blocks. Many fights took place at distances of only a few meters. Flamethrowers were used to sweep through rooms, grenades were tossed around corners. In narrow corridors, submachine guns and bayonets decided the fate of entire groups of soldiers. The sound of falling metal, bullets striking steel, shouting men, and burning fires blended into a chaotic roar that survivors later described as a nightmare that never seemed to end. On the Soviet side, General Vasily Chuikov understood that he did not need to hold the entire factory complex. He only needed to hold enough to prevent the Germans from stabilizing their positions. Every time German troops captured a workshop, the Red Army almost immediately counterattacked. They slipped through basements, moved through broken walls, and appeared behind or beside the enemy. As a result, a single factory complex could be split into fragments. One side might hold the rows of machinery, the other side held the steel warehouse. Between them lay a courtyard filled with bodies and twisted metal. While the fighting raged inside the factories, what remained of civilian life in Stalingrad also merged into the war. Workers, women, and teenagers too young to be formally enlisted helped carry ammunition, build barricades, and treat the wounded. Some people worked on production lines in the morning and by afternoon were holding rifles to defend the factory where they had labored. Here, the war erased the line between soldier and civilian. The weather also began to change. Autumn slowly drifted toward cold. Rain turned the ground into thick mud. Corridors of rubble filled with water and ice. Soldiers on both sides lacked proper winter clothing. They slept in freezing rooms, damp basements, or directly among piles of broken brick. But perhaps the most important change was that the Germans began losing the very thing that had once defined their strength: speed. Every advance now required days of preparation. Each victory was measured only in a row of rooms or a corner of a workshop, and the cost was always enormous casualties. On the Soviet side, the losses were just as terrible. Many units that crossed the Volga were shattered within days. Yet, the flow of reinforcements never stopped. At night, small boats continued quietly ferrying fresh soldiers to the western bank. They entered the burning factories with a simple but ruthless mission: hold on for one more day. And that time was exactly what the Soviet High Command needed. While the world watched the burning factories of Stalingrad, far to the north and south of the city, other Red Army formations were quietly gathering. New tank units, fresh infantry divisions, additional artillery. Generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky were not only looking at the ruins of Stalingrad, they were studying the entire map of the front. And they began to realize something extremely important. While German forces were being drawn deeper and deeper into the street, fighting of the city, their flanks were being held by much weaker Romanian armies. A strategic gap was beginning to form. And if that gap were struck at the right moment, in the right place, Stalingrad might not merely become a place where the Red Army struggled to survive. It could become the greatest trap of the entire war. While German and Soviet soldiers continued fighting room by room inside the factories, far behind the lines, the Stavka began preparing the counteroffensive that could change the fate of the entire Eastern Front. While the brutal battles inside the factories of northern Stalingrad continued hour by hour, room by room, at another level of the war, an entirely different plan was slowly taking shape. While most of the world's attention and much of the German command's focus was fixed on the ruins of the city along the Volga, the Soviet High Command began looking at Stalingrad in a different way. Not simply as a place that had to be held, but as a giant anchor pinning a German army into exactly the position where it could be destroyed. This was the moment when the strategic thinking of the Red Army began to change profoundly. Throughout 1941 and the early months of 1942, the Soviet Union had mostly fought in desperate defense. Counterattacks were often launched hastily, poorly coordinated, and sometimes resulted in enormous losses without achieving a clear strategic result. But by late 1942, after more than a year of learning through blood, the Stavka had begun to accumulate something extremely important: experience in organizing a large-scale counteroffensive. The men behind that transformation were Generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky. They were not simply looking at the city of Stalingrad itself. They were studying the entire structure of the front, and when they did so, they saw a clear paradox. Germany's Sixth Army, one of the strongest formations in the Wehrmacht, was being drawn deep into a savage urban battle. Elite German units were being worn down day after day inside the factories, the streets, and the basements of Stalingrad. Yet while that spearhead pushed into the city, its flanks were guarded by far weaker Allied forces, Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies. North of Stalingrad, the Romanian Third Army held a long stretch of front along the Don River. They lacked modern anti-tank weapons, lacked mobility, and lacked reserves. South of the city, the Romanian Fourth Army defended another long and thin front line. Farther away, Italian and Hungarian formations held other sectors supporting the German advance. These armies were not without courage, but they had been placed in a role far beyond their capabilities, holding vast defensive lines against the possibility of a Soviet counteroffensive. Zhukov and Vasilevsky understood that this was the real weakness of the entire German campaign around Stalingrad. If the Red Army attacked directly against the Sixth Army entrenched inside the city, they would pay a terrible price without any guarantee of decisive results. But if they struck the flanks held by the Romanian armies, they could sever the entire German force trapped in Stalingrad. In other words, instead of trying to break the enemy's spearhead, they decided to strike the shaft of the spear. However, to accomplish this, the Soviet Union needed two things: time and secrecy. Time was purchased with the blood of those fighting inside Stalingrad. Every day that Zhukov's 62nd Army managed to hold a strip of ground along the Volga was another day for Stavka to prepare the counteroffensive. Every day the Germans continued pouring their strength into the factory battles was another day gained. Secrecy was far more difficult. A large encirclement operation could not be carried out with just a few divisions. It required hundreds of thousands of soldiers, hundreds of tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, and an enormous logistical system. All of these forces had to be concentrated without revealing the true scale of the plan to the enemy. Throughout September and October of 1942, while Stalingrad continued to burn, military trains began moving in the darkness far behind the front. New divisions were transferred from different regions. Tanks, artillery, and ammunition were brought to assembly areas. Mechanized units were held back, rather than being thrown into the desperate fighting inside the city. From the German perspective, these movements were not always clearly visible. The German High Command still believed that Stalingrad itself was the center of the entire campaign. They continued concentrating their efforts on capturing each factory, each district, each street. Intelligence reports about Soviet troop concentrations far from the city were sometimes underestimated because their attention was overwhelmingly fixed on the battle directly in front of them. It was one of the greatest strategic mistakes Germany made during the entire campaign. While German soldiers were fighting room by room, the Stavka had begun designing an operation far larger than the battle for the city itself. The operation was named Uranus. The plan for Uranus was simple in concept, but extremely complex in execution. 2 massive offensives would be launched simultaneously, one from the north against the Romanian Third Army, one from the south against the Romanian Fourth Army. Once those defensive lines were broken, Soviet armored and mechanized forces would drive deep into the rear, pushing toward the area of Kalach on the Don River. If the 2 spearheads met, a giant ring of encirclement would form around Stalingrad. Inside that ring would not only be the German units fighting inside the city, it would trap the entire 6th Army and a large portion of the German 4th Panzer Army. It was such a bold objective that many initially doubted it, but the Stavka prepared for it carefully. More than 1 million soldiers were assembled for the entire operation. Hundreds of T-34 tanks were concentrated in the breakthrough sectors. Thousands of artillery pieces were deployed to clear the way for the infantry. Tactical air forces were also mobilized to support the advancing armies. What made the situation remarkable was that while all of this preparation was happening, the battle inside Stalingrad continued with full intensity. Mamayev Kurgan still changed hands. The factories still burned. Red Army units still clung to narrow strips of land along the Volga. But now those battles carried a different meaning. They were no longer simply defensive. They were the anchor holding the German 6th Army exactly where the Stavka wanted it. October passed. Then early November arrived. The weather grew colder. After weeks of autumn rain, the ground began to freeze. For tanks and artillery, this was far better terrain than the mud that had come before. Soviet units completed their final preparations. Inside the city, Chuikov's soldiers might not have known the full scale of the plan. They only knew that they had to hold on one more day, one more night. Something enormous was being prepared behind them. Meanwhile, on the German side, most commanders were still looking east, toward the Volga, toward the factory districts not yet fully captured, toward the victory they believed was only a few steps away. But while they kept looking forward, on their flanks, the doors of the trap were slowly closing. And on a freezing morning in November 1942, the skies north of Stalingrad thundered with the sound of Soviet artillery. Operation Uranus had begun. In the early hours of November 19, 1942, the sky north of Stalingrad was still covered in a thick fog of the approaching winter. The ground had frozen after weeks of autumn rain, and the wind blowing across the steppe carried a biting cold. Along the front lines, the Romanian Third Army held long defensive positions stretching along the Don River. To them, it seemed like another ordinary day of war, but only minutes later, the ground began to tremble. Soviet artillery opened fire. Thousands of guns roared at once, unleashing a storm of steel onto the Romanian positions. Shells crashed into trenches, command posts, artillery batteries, and communication points. Columns of earth and smoke rose across the front. For hours, the bombardment did not stop, plunging the entire northern defensive line around Stalingrad into chaos. This was not the kind of artillery barrage meant to support a limited attack. It was the opening of a massive operation that the Stavka had been preparing for weeks, Operation Uranus. As the thunder of the guns slowly faded, T-34 tanks began to appear out of the fog. Behind them came Soviet infantry formations. The attacking columns advanced across frost-covered fields, driving straight into the Romanian defenses. Many Romanian soldiers fought bravely. They used light artillery, infantry weapons, and Molotov cocktails to fight the tanks. But courage could not compensate for the lack of equipment. Most Romanian units simply did not possess enough modern anti-tank weapons to face the T-34s advancing under heavy artillery support. Within the first few hours, the defensive lines began to crack. By the end of November 19th, large gaps had opened across the northern front. These were not small breaches that could quickly be patched. They were massive tiers, wide enough for Soviet mechanized forces to pour through and drive deep into the rear. The following day, November 20th, the second blow struck south of Stalingrad. This time, the target was the Romanian Fourth Army. Once again, Soviet artillery began with a devastating barrage. Then tanks and infantry surged forward through the smoke. The southern defensive lines began to collapse as well. In less than 2 days, both flanks of the German Sixth Army had been torn apart. Romanian units were cut off from each other, many of them disintegrating completely. Some attempted to retreat in confusion, others were surrounded and destroyed where they stood. Meanwhile, Soviet mechanized forces did not stop. After breaking through the lines, they drove deep into the German rear areas. Tanks and motorized infantry advanced rapidly through territory that had previously been considered safe. German supply convoys were suddenly attacked. Rear area headquarters fell into confusion as they realized the front line had simply vanished. Inside Stalingrad, German officers began receiving disturbing reports. At first, the news arrived in fragments. A Romanian unit pushed back, a defensive line broken, Soviet tanks appearing in the rear. But as the reports continued to arrive, the larger picture became clear. The flanks of the Sixth Army were collapsing. This was the moment when the direction of the entire campaign began to reverse. For months, German forces had been the hunters, pushing deep into Soviet territory. Now they began to sense that they themselves might become the prey. The Soviet spearheads from north and south kept driving deeper behind the German lines. Their objective was not to seize Stalingrad immediately. Their goal was to close the ring. The meeting point had been chosen near Kalach on the Don River, where a strategic bridge connected the German supply routes. On November 22nd, a Soviet tank unit approached that bridge. Through a combination of speed and surprise, they captured it almost intact before the Germans could destroy it. From that moment on, the closing of the encirclement was only a matter of time. On November 23, 1942, the attacking forces from the north and the south met near Kalach. Soldiers advancing from both directions shook hands across the frozen fields. The ring had closed. Inside the massive pocket was a huge Axis force. Not only the German Sixth Army, but also surviving Romanian units, parts of the German 4th Panzer Army, along with tens of thousands of logistical personnel, artillery crews, medical units, and support troops. In total, somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 men were trapped inside the encirclement. For the Stavka, it was an enormous strategic victory. They had not only held Stalingrad, they had transformed the defense of the city into a gigantic trap designed to destroy one of Germany's strongest armies. For the German High Command, it was a devastating shock. In the first days after the encirclement closed, the situation was not yet completely hopeless. Some German generals believed the Sixth Army might still be able to break out if it acted quickly. Paulus still had some tanks and artillery. His forces might attempt to break out to the west before the Soviets could fully consolidate their ring. But the final decision did not belong to Paulus. In Berlin, Hitler refused to authorize a retreat. He ordered the Sixth Army to hold its ground and turn the Stalingrad area into a defensive fortress. According to Hitler's plan, the trapped army would be supplied by air until a relief offensive from outside could reach them. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, confidently declared that the German Air Force could supply the entire encircled army. It was a promise built on illusion. To maintain even minimal operations, the Sixth Army required roughly 600 to 700 tons of supplies every day. But the available transport aircraft were far too few. The Russian winter brought brutal conditions. Fog, ice, and Soviet anti-aircraft fire turned every flight into a gamble. In the early days, some aircraft still managed to land at airfields such as Potomnik and Gumrak inside the pocket. They brought small amounts of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. They also evacuated some wounded soldiers. But reality soon became clear. The supply deliveries never came close to what was needed. Some days only a few dozen tons arrived. On other days, almost nothing reached the trapped army. Meanwhile, the Red Army began tightening the ring. Artillery was deployed around the entire pocket. Soviet aircraft patrolled the skies, hunting German transport planes. The approaches to the airfields were constantly bombarded. The Sixth Army was no longer the spearhead pressing toward the Volga. It had become a massive force trapped in the snow, cut off from the rear, and increasingly dependent on a handful of aircraft struggling through the winter sky. From this point on, the Battle of Stalingrad entered a new chapter. It was no longer a battle to capture a city. It had become a battle to survive inside a tightening pocket, where hunger, cold, and disease would become enemies just as deadly as artillery and bullets. When the encirclement closed around Stalingrad in late November 1942, the world inside that pocket did not immediately understand the scale of the disaster that was unfolding. Germany's Sixth Army, along with tens of thousands of Allied soldiers and logistical personnel, had suddenly been cut off from its entire supply system. Yet in the first days, many German officers still believed the situation was temporary. They had survived difficult situations before. And this time they hoped there would be either a relief operation from the outside or a breakout from within. Those hopes did not vanish immediately. In the first days after the encirclement formed, German units still had certain reserves. Ammunition stocks remained. Some tanks were still operational. Airfields such as Potomnik and Gumrak were still capable of receiving transport aircraft. And whenever a Junkers Ju-52 or a Heinkel appeared in the sky, it carried not only crates of ammunition or sacks of flour, it carried the belief that Berlin had not abandoned them. But war has a cruel way of destroying such beliefs. The greatest problem facing the Sixth Army was not ammunition. It was food and fuel. An army of more than 250,000 men, along with tens of thousands of horses, thousands of vehicles, and heavy artillery, required an enormous volume of supplies each day just to maintain minimal operations. The estimated requirement was roughly 600 to 700 tons of supplies daily. But the Luftwaffe never came close to achieving that. Even on the best days, the deliveries reached only a fraction of what was needed. Some days brought around 100 tons, some days far less. And on many days, snowstorms or dense fog meant that not a single aircraft could land. The Russian winter began tightening its grip around Stalingrad. Cold winds swept across the steppe and through the ruins of the city. Temperatures dropped below minus 20 degrees Celsius, sometimes even lower. German soldiers who had once fought summer campaigns now had to survive in damp bunkers, shattered buildings, or trenches coated with ice. Many lacked proper winter clothing. Many boots were torn or frozen stiff. At night, the cold became an invisible enemy. Soldiers slept pressed tightly together in basements, trying to share what little warmth they could. But many never woke up. On some mornings, comrades would shake a soldier's shoulder and realize he had died in his sleep from the cold. Food began to run out. At first, rations were reduced, then reduced again. Bread became scarce. Meat nearly disappeared. The horses that had once pulled artillery or supply wagons were gradually slaughtered for food. Eventually, even that source was gone. A daily ration might shrink to only a few hundred grams of hard bread and a bowl of thin soup. The human body began to weaken. Soldiers who had once marched dozens of kilometers now struggled to stand after a night's sleep. Their faces grew gaunt, their eyes hollow, their skin pale and gray from malnutrition. Disease began to spread. Dysentery moved through crowded shelters. Infections raged because there were almost no medicines left. A small wound could become a death sentence without antibiotics. Field hospitals inside the pocket quickly overflowed. Freezing rooms were packed with wounded men lying on stretchers or simply on the floor. Meanwhile, the airfields inside the pocket became lifelines. Potomnik was the largest and most important of them. Transport aircraft landed there carrying ammunition, medicine, and small amounts of food. But every landing had to face Soviet artillery and brutal weather. Ice covered the runways. Aircraft could easily slide during landing. Some were struck by shells the moment they touched down. And when the aircraft prepared to take off again, hundreds of wounded soldiers crowded around them. Not everyone could leave. Many severely wounded men lay on stretchers in the freezing air, waiting for a chance to be evacuated. But many of them would never leave Stalingrad. As time passed, the Soviet ring tightened further. Soviet artillery bombarded the airfields. German internal supply routes were cut. Defensive sectors were pushed back step by step. One by one, the airfields fell to the Red Army. When Potomnik fell in January 1943, it was a fatal blow. From that point forward, supplying the pocket by air became almost impossible. Inside the encirclement, hope began to crumble. A relief operation from the outside had indeed been launched in December 1942. German forces under General Manstein attempted to open a corridor towards Stalingrad. For a short time, they advanced quite close to the pocket, but the Sixth Army was not permitted to break out to meet them. Hitler still ordered them to hold their ground. The distance between the relief force and Paulus's army eventually became too great. The external offensive stalled. And when that happened, many German officers inside Stalingrad understood that their final chance had passed. From that moment on, collapse was only a matter of time. German soldiers continued fighting, but many units had now become shadows of themselves. A company might have only a few dozen men left. A battalion might be reduced to a few hundred. Tanks had almost no fuel left. Artillery lacked shells. Inside freezing shelters, soldiers began speaking about something they had rarely considered before: surrender. But for the German command, surrender was not an easy option. At the end of January 1943, Hitler promoted Friedrich Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. In the history of the German army, no field marshal had ever been captured alive. The message was unmistakable. Hitler expected Paulus to fight to the death. But the reality inside Stalingrad had already gone far beyond symbolism. Exhausted, starving, freezing soldiers were no longer an army capable of prolonged resistance. Units disintegrated. Defensive positions collapsed piece by piece. Stalingrad was no longer a battle between two great armies. It had become the slow death of an army once considered invincible. And in the final days of January 1943, as Soviet artillery drew closer and German units were split into isolated groups among the city's ruins, history was moving toward an unavoidable moment. The moment when the Sixth Army, the pride of the Wehrmacht, would collapse completely. And with that collapse, one of the greatest turning points of World War II would be written among the shattered bricks of Stalingrad. By January 1943, Stalingrad no longer resembled a city. Districts that had once held homes, shops, and parks were now nothing but fields of shattered brick covered by snow and ash. Factories that had once echoed with the noise of machinery stood as twisted skeletons of steel. Roads that had once led to the Volga docks had turned into frozen corridors where the wrecks of tanks, artillery pieces, and trucks lay scattered like metallic bones. Amid that landscape, Germany's Sixth Army was dying. In the final weeks of the encirclement, German forces were no longer fighting as a maneuvering army. They were simply trying to hold small fragments of ground, one basement, one ruined house at a time. Units had been split into isolated groups with little or no communication. A regiment might have only a few dozen men left. A company sometimes consisted of only a handful of soldiers. Food had almost completely run out. The last rations were divided into hard pieces of bread, sometimes mixed with sawdust or unknown flour, simply to stretch supplies for a few more days. Many soldiers survived on frozen horse meat or even soup boiled from leather straps and scraps of hide. Their bodies weakened rapidly. Faces that had once been strong were now little more than skin and bone. The cold showed no mercy. Russian winter temperatures continued to fall below -20 degrees Celsius. Winds swept through broken walls and turned basements into freezing chambers. Many soldiers suffered frostbite in their hands, feet, and faces. Fingers turned black. Men too weak to move were left behind in frozen shelters. Disease spread everywhere. Field hospitals inside the pocket had no medicines left. Doctors performed surgery without proper instruments. Many wounded soldiers lay on the freezing floor without bandages or painkillers. In many cases, the only thing a nurse could do was sit beside a patient and wait for him to die. Meanwhile, the Red Army tightened the ring day by day. Soviet artillery continued to bombard the remaining German positions. Infantry units advanced slowly through the ruins, splitting the remaining defensive areas into smaller and smaller pockets. For them, Victory had become only a matter of time. By the end of January 1943, the Sixth Army had effectively been divided into two parts. The southern sector of the pocket in central Stalingrad contained the headquarters of General Friedrich Paulus. The northern sector around the factory district still held scattered German units clinging to their last positions. Even in that desperate situation, Berlin continued sending impossible orders. On January 30th, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. It was not a reward. It was a message. In the history of the German army, no field marshal had ever been captured alive. Hitler expected Paulus to choose death rather than surrender. But by the time that order reached Stalingrad, the reality on the ground had long surpassed the symbols of honor. Paulus was no longer commanding an army capable of continued battle. He commanded a mass of exhausted, starving, sick men who could barely resist anymore. Many units had lost contact entirely. Artillery had no shells. Tanks had no fuel. On the morning of January 31st, 1943, Soviet troops entered the central district where Paulus had established his headquarters. After months of brutal fighting, that moment unfolded almost quietly. General Paulus was captured alive. He did not commit suicide. He did not order his men to fight to the last soldier. He surrendered. But the Battle of Stalingrad did not end immediately. In the northern part of the city, the remaining German units continued fighting for several more days. Some soldiers did not even know their headquarters had collapsed. They still tried to hold their final positions among the snow and rubble. On February 2nd, 1943, the last resistance ended. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. When the final shots faded, the result was one of the greatest military disasters Germany would suffer in the entire war. More than 90,000 German and Allied soldiers emerged from the ruins to surrender. They were gaunt, exhausted, many barely able to walk. Long columns of prisoners moved slowly through the snow-covered streets beneath the blackened shells of Stalingrad's buildings. Hundreds of thousands of others had died during the battle. Among the captured soldiers, only a small number would ever return home. Many prisoners would die in the years that followed from disease, starvation, and the harsh conditions of captivity. But Stalingrad was not only the tragedy of the Sixth Army. It was a turning point for the entire Second World War. Before Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht had usually been the attacking force, pushing deep into enemy territory. After Stalingrad, the balance began to shift. Germany had lost one of its strongest armies. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, and enormous quantities of equipment had been destroyed. More importantly, the myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility had been shattered. For the Soviet Union, the victory carried immense meaning. It proved that the Red Army could not only defend, but also encircle and destroy a major German force. From Stalingrad onward, the Soviet Union increasingly seized the strategic initiative. For the world, Stalingrad became a symbol of resistance and sacrifice. A city almost erased from the map had become the stage for one of the most decisive battles in human history. Millions of people had fought, died, and endured there. The ruined streets, the burning factories, and the freezing basements became the setting of a struggle whose outcome would shape the rest of the century. And as the winter of 1943 slowly passed, as snow continued to fall over the broken bricks of Stalingrad, one chapter of the war had come to an end. But from those ashes, another chapter had begun. From Stalingrad, the road leading to Kursk, to Kiev, to Warsaw, and eventually to Berlin had begun to open, and the world would never again see this war the same way. When we look back at the entire story of Stalingrad, what makes people reflect the most is not only the enormous numbers behind the battle. More than 2 million people were drawn into that confrontation that lasted for months. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died among the shattered bricks of the city. An industrial city on the banks of the Volga was almost erased from the map. But behind those cold statistics lies something far deeper. Stalingrad shows how war can turn an ordinary place into the center of history in just a few short months. Before 1942, Stalingrad was simply an important Soviet industrial city. It had factories, ports, railways, and residential districts like thousands of other cities. But when the war arrived, everything changed. Streets became front lines, factories became fortresses, Basements became places where people struggled to survive under bombs and shell fire. And from those seemingly ordinary places, one of the most decisive battles of the 20th century was written. Stalingrad also reminds us that history is not always shaped solely by the great decisions made on strategic maps. Sometimes it is decided by unknown individuals fighting in dark rooms, shattered corridors, and freezing trenches. Soviet soldiers holding every meter of ground in the city. German soldiers trying to survive amid hunger and the brutal cold. Factory workers who built tanks during the day and took up rifles to defend their city. All of them, regardless of which side of the front line they stood on, became part of a story far larger than their own lives. And perhaps that is why Stalingrad continues to haunt history even today. It is not only a battle, it is a symbol of endurance, of willpower, and of the terrible price that war always demands from human beings. When we look at the old photographs of the city after the battle, where nothing remained but blackened walls and piles of snow-covered rubble, it is hard to imagine that from that place one of the great turning points of World War II began. Yet, from those ruins, the balance of the war shifted, and from Stalingrad, the path of the war began to move in an entirely different direction. History is sometimes written by battles that last for years. But sometimes it is decided by a single city, a single winter, and a moment when the whole world seems to hold its breath. And Stalingrad was one of those moments. If you found the story of the Battle of Stalingrad offers new perspectives on history and war, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your ideas, questions, and perspectives can make the discussion even richer. And if you'd like to continue exploring battles, campaigns, and lesser-known stories from the history of war, don't forget to subscribe to the History War channel so you won't miss the upcoming videos.